Lucy Morgan was an artist. She had spent a week painting in a small country town and decided the next day she could move on. She would go to a village called Kingston. But that night, Lucy Morgan had a strange dream. She dreamed that she was walking up a dark carved staircase and entered a bedroom. It was an ordinary room except for two things. The carpet was made up of large squares that looked like trapdoors, and each of the windows was fastened with big nails that stuck up out of the wood. In her dream, Lucy Morgan went to sleep in this bedroom. During the night, a woman with a pale face, black eyes, and long black hair came into the room. She leaned over the bed and whispered, "This is an evil place. Flee while you can." When the woman touched her arm to hurry her along, Lucy Morgan awakened from the dream with a shriek. She lay awake the rest of the night, trembling. Despite the little information in her story, The Dream, part of the Scary Stories series, the Pale Woman, or the Pale Lady as she'd become known, has haunted the thoughts and dreams of horror fans for decades. But who is she? Where did she come from? In fact, where do any urban legends, folklore, and sleepover stories come from? To find out how a legend is born and a monster walks among us, stick around to the end of this video. Welcome to Horror History. Few series in children's literature have remained as popular and as controversial as Alvin Schwartz's Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Inspired by folklore, reimagined to film, and still topping banned book lists to this day, the Scary Stories series has dominated sleepovers for decades. And while the 3-book series features a full collection of frightening short-form tales, the Pale Lady of the Dream, published in Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones, remains one of the most puzzling and captivating creatures introduced between the bleeding ink pages of the Scary Stories series. As always in horror history, I'll be analyzing the timeline. But the timeline of the Pale Lady from the Scary Story series is as mysterious and twisted as her appearance. So today, we're digging 6 feet deeper into her origin from a Victorian dream to a living urban legend. Is she a monster? Is she a spirit? Is she right behind me? I'll sort all this out on the other side of the horror history screen. In the story The Dream, a young woman, Lucy Morgan, receives a warning in her dream from a woman with a pale face, black eyes, and long black hair telling her to flee that evil place. After a quick huddle with her landlady, Lucy moves to a different neighboring city, Dorset. She rents a room that's shockingly similar to the dark room from her dream, right down to the trapdoor carpet. Convincing herself it's all cool, she answers a knock at the door, only to have the Pale Lady from her dream enter. Lucy understandably takes her things and flees. To understand what's going on that page and a half of text, let's start at the beginning. The author, Alvin Schwartz, first published Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark in 1981. Schwartz usually leaves detailed background references and notes in the back of all 3 Scary Stories books, but for The Dream, he simply wrote, "This dream is a puzzle," which is kind of odd. Schwartz, prior to Scary Stories, was a journalist and prone to heavy research, particularly in folklore. The stories included in his spine-tingling series are adaptations of tales retold around the globe, from children raised by wolves in Utah to cursed horses from Swiss legend. But while most of the adapted pieces in Schwartz's books have a specific regional etymology, The Dream is one of the few adapted from a slightly different source. Victorians were super into the supernatural. Everybody had a ghost story that they really believed, and a home's haunted ghost room was no joke. There were classic hauntings of headless soldiers roaming halls and knocks on doors you do not want to answer. Augustus Hare was a British author of many books in the Victorian era, including a 7-volume autobiography called The Story of My Life. Really getting creative with the title there, Augie. The book recounts nights spent inside of ghost rooms and portentous dreams which have inspired many horror works since his death in 1903, including a few others in the Scary Stories series. One example is Like Cat's Eyes, the tale of a wife caring for her ill husband who is frightened by the arrival of a hearse drawn by 4 horses. The Window is another example, and Augustus Hare's version has its own notoriety. Margaret found herself staring through the window at a shrunken face like that of a mummy. Its yellow-green eyes gleamed like a cat's eyes. She wanted to scream, but she was so frightened that she could not make a sound. The creature broke the window glass, unlocked the window, and crawled inside. It came across the room, and her terror was so great that she could not scream. And it came up to the bed and twisted its long, bony fingers into her hair, and it dragged her head over the side of the bed, and it bit her violently in the throat. However, The Dream, where we first meet the Pale Lady, was not a direct retelling like The Window and Like Cat's Eyes. It's more of a reimagining of one of the many ghost tales included in Augustus Hare's mid-1800s autobiography. As the story goes, Mrs. Butler, while living in Ireland, dreamt of the most enchanting house. Years later, she and her husband moved back to London, where she began searching for a home. Upon visiting an unusually low-priced manor, Mrs. Butler was shocked to discover that the house was her house from her dream. After purchasing it, they inquired as to why the price had been so low, at which point the agent revealed that the house was believed to have been haunted. Very convenient of her to disclose that after the sale had already closed. But now, they had realized that Mrs. Butler had been the ghost all along. She was astral projecting in her sleep into the house years ago. It's an interesting concept, but still pretty far off from the story that we're familiar with from The Dream in Scary Stories. There's no mention of a pale lady, or a warning, or even a trapdoor carpet. But there is a woman dreaming of a house and moving cities only to end up in that very real domicile. And though the names of the cities are different, Kingston and Dorset, mentioned in The Dream, are located in Britain, where Mrs. Butler moved and found her literal dream house. Given that the tale originated from the Victorian era, I'm going to assume that our setting is sometime in the mid to late 1800s. But let's be honest, when we're thinking about the Pale Lady, we're not thinking about when. We're thinking about that face. And the appearance of this mysterious woman has a bit of history of its own. Since Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was first published in 1981, the books have been subject to banning and removal from libraries due to their graphic content. But any diehard fan will tell you it's not the story that haunts you, it's the illustrations. Dark and moody, seemingly rotting on the page, illustrator Stephen Gammell's macabre drawings of decrepit buildings and empty eye sockets are powerful. So powerful that when HarperCollins reprinted the books in 2011 with Gammell's artwork replaced with more kid-friendly versions from Brett Hellquist, petitions to bring back the OG art began before the reprints even hit the shelves. Despite many chilling creatures living between the pages of Scary Stories, the Pale Lady has become the most well-remembered image from the hair-raising series, beloved by horror fans and probably burned into the memories of innocent children browsing their local library. The actual words of the dream give a very basic description of her black eyes and hair, but the accompanying illustration creates a whole other dimension. Many of Gammell's illustrations featured in Scary Stories are ghastly, but the Pale Lady's expression has been described as benevolent, which is supported by her role in the story of warning off Lucy from the room. Stephen Gammell has never spoken at length about his work in Scary Stories, but commented about illustrating work in general. The first time I read a manuscript, I can immediately tell whether I want to illustrate it. I may not know how the illustrations will look, but I get a certain feeling for the text. I respond to the words, and if I can respond to a story, I can illustrate it. Meaning that the illustrative design of the Pale Lady is entirely inspired by the written word of the dream and not an outside source. The original source from Augustus Hare doesn't mention a pale lady or pale woman anywhere in the text, nor does Alvin Schwartz reimagining in Scary Stories offer many specific descriptors of her character beyond a very simple physical description. The impression of the Pale Lady is entirely based on our own interpretation. It's no secret that most of the short stories featured in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark are common urban legends, such as The Hook, but the dream truly embraces the spirit of an urban legend by coming to life more and more with each retelling. And in the 2019 film adaptation, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, the Pale Lady was written out of the illustration and into another reality.
What's that?
I can't believe it. It's her book of scary stories.
The screenplay, as adapted by Dan and Kevin Hageman from a story by producer Guillermo del Toro, who is no stranger to Victorian horror, follows a group of misfit teens who open a book that they shouldn't have opened and release the creatures of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark into the real world. An ironically similar concept as the film adaptation for its fellow children's horror literature juggernaut Goosebumps. To be fair to the Scary Stories film, it's pretty gnarly. Just as with the books, while the Goosebumps film generally stayed in its lane of kid horror, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark does not shy away from body horror, light gore, and some Victorian haunt sentiments, as one would hope and expect.
Our friend was a little nosy.
In most cases where a book is adapted to the screen, the book is considered canon, and I stick to that when analyzing the timeline. But with The Pale Lady, given its nature and continuously evolving legend, we can consider the film to be more of a continuation of her legend. As noted, we surmise the events of the dream are happening in Britain most likely during the Victorian age in the mid to late 1800s, while the events of the film occur in 1968 in the US state of Pennsylvania. So it could be said that The Pale Lady first appeared in Britain, then reappeared in the small town of Mill Valley, Pennsylvania in 1968 after being unleashed from the book. I assume the book that the kids find in the movie would be similar in content to the Scary Story trilogy in our world. Only in the film, the book was not written by Alvin Schwartz, but by Sarah Bellows, a young girl locked in a basement by her family at an undisclosed time in the past.
The Bellows had a secret, a daughter, that they never allowed to leave the house. The myth is that there was something really off about her.
In her imprisonment, she wrote scary stories that she would recite to kids listening on the other side of her wall.
And though they never saw her, they could hear her through the wall. Sarah told them stories. Scary stories.
So of course, they take the book, which begins to write stories all by itself. I hope when I die I leave behind a book that just writes horror history scripts. But I'll probably just get the same thing that the heroes of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark got. Stories about a murderous scarecrow, a corpse toe, a jangly man, an infected cheek, and a pale woman. Stories that come alive. Each story, rather than being a standalone tale, is related to a specific teenager's fear, or just something that annoys them, including the Pale Lady. In this case, Chuck, one of our 4 teenage heroes, recounts a recurring nightmare to his friends, describing someone who sounds very familiar.
I had this messed up dream again. I was trapped in the red room, and there's that fat pale lady who keeps whispering, "This is an evil place. Run away while you still can."
Soon after, the kids take a field trip to a hospital looking for answers, like one does in a horror movie. There, Chuck separates from the group, which is never a good idea, and wanders off to another building on the grounds. He finds himself in a series of empty hallways as the hospital alarm goes off and the lights turns red. And she appears. Pale face, black eyes, wide, thin smile. The Pale Lady. In this adaptation, the Pale Lady is considered by fans to be the most faithful representation of a character from the book. The main difference is the ability to see her feet, bare and pillowy as the rest of her, and a nightgown that seems to melt into her skin. You can't determine where she begins and the fabric ends. Despite Chuck's dream, the Pale Lady doesn't speak beyond unearthly murmurs as she shuffles slowly towards him. Appearing in every hallway before cornering him in the center, the Pale Lady gives Chuck a deep hug, pulling him into her body with a satisfied smile, and she disappears.
Chuck and Augie are still gone, but I know there is a way to bring them back and that the secret is in the book, and we won't stop until we find them.
Until the unpleasantness with Chuck, the Pale Lady hadn't been considered an antagonist, and she still might not be. She was only trying to warn Lucy about the danger of the house in that short story, and until we know where Chuck disappears to in the movie, I can't definitively say that the Pale Lady is evil. Perhaps with the spirit of Sarah Bellows stirring the pot, the Pale Lady was trying to save Chuck in her own way by taking him to a realm where he'd be safe. But Sarah Bellows' inclusion does complicate things. Alvin Schwartz's work was openly based and adapted from folklore and other tales, but within the world of the film, the spirit of Sarah Bellows is writing these stories in real time. That would imply that the urban legend, the dream, never existed in the movie universe, unless, of course, Sarah is writing new lore for a character from an existing legend.
You don't read the book. The book reads you.
At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that there were 2 other tales in Scary Stories inspired by the accounts included in the autobiography of Augustus Hare, The Window and Like a Cat's Eyes. Both of these stories are almost direct lists from their source material, with the same beats, same characters, and even some word-for-word dialogue.
Stories hurt. Stories heal.
So in this case, we're not analyzing her timeline, we're building it, making her more real each time we do so. Starting in the mid-1800s with the story of a woman who allegedly dreamt of a home that was proven real. Her tale was preserved within the autobiography of Augustus Hare in 1859. Then in 1991, Alvin Schwartz publishes Scary Stories 3: More Tales to Chill Your Bones, including the short story The Dream, which introduces a character who would become known as the Pale Lady. In 2019, the film adaptation, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, reintroduces the Pale Lady in the year 1968, first as a dream and then as a walking, physical creature to audiences new and old.
Stories hurt. Stories heal. If we repeat them often enough, they become real. They have that power. They make us who we are.
Who is the Pale Lady? An urban legend that grows more visceral with each retelling of the story. Who knows when we'll meet next? Let me know if there are any other Scary Stories characters you'd like to see covered here on Horror History. Remember to subscribe to CZ's World for new horrors every week, ring the death bell and select all notifications, and I'll see you in the next one, assuming we both survive.